Hey everyone, Fareed here on the Rational Fareed. Let me ask you something. Have you ever heard the one about how the entire Old Testament, written thousands of years ago by ancient prophets, totally predicted Jesus? Like, every single detail was mapped out centuries in advance. It's probably the go-to argument for a lot of Christians trying to prove their faith is true, right? Look, prophecy fulfilled, case closed. They pull out a verse here, point to a story in the Gospels there, and bam, instant divine proof. But what if I told you that entire argument isn't just shaky? What if it's actually based on something closer to intentional deception? What if the prophecies they point to have absolutely nothing to do with Jesus in their original context? Get ready, because we're about to unpack these supposed predictions and ask the real question. Is it brilliant divine prophecy, or just plain old-fashioned piffle? Stick around, because this is going to get interesting. So how do they do it? How do Christian apologists take these ancient texts and make them sound like a crystal ball for the first century? It's a pattern you see over and over, and once you recognize it, it becomes, well, painfully familiar. They grab a line, sometimes just a snippet, from a book in the Old Testament. Could be from Isaiah, maybe Micah, Psalms, any number of places. Then, they jump forward hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 years, to the New Testament Gospels, point to something Jesus supposedly did or had happened to him, and declare, see, this verse exactly predicted this event. Prophecy fulfilled. And the grand claim, that verse after verse, dotted throughout the entire Old Testament, were all specifically pointing towards a coming Messiah, and that all of these prophecies were perfectly fulfilled in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It's presented as undeniable proof. They want you to believe that writers centuries before Jesus was even born were somehow charting out his life story in advance. And honestly, framing it that way, making it sound like definitive proof. That's where it crosses the line into something that feels like an outrageous deceit. It gives their story a weight and credibility it simply hasn't earned. Okay, so that's the method. Now, let's actually look at some of their star examples and see if the reality holds up. Now, you might think this whole prophecy fulfillment game is something modern apologists came up with to sound clever. But nope. This tactic, Christians were using this from the jump. We're talking way back, to the 2nd century, when the Gospels themselves were being written and circulated. Even then, the people putting these stories together weren't pointing to solid, tangible evidence for Jesus. They didn't have artifacts. They didn't have testimony from actual impartial witnesses outside of their own circles. So what did they do? They turned to what they did have. The ancient, revered texts of the Jews. They essentially piggybacked their new story onto the older, established scriptures. Think about that. They took hundreds of years of Jewish history, law, poetry, commentary, the entire vast body of work of an entire people, and reduced it down to being just the prologue, just the setup act for their guy, Jesus. Because they didn't have real evidence, they had to borrow legitimacy from somewhere else, and the Jewish texts were right there. And this desperate need to find proof in older texts is exactly why we get these supposed prophecies. Like, for example, the virgin birth claim. Okay, let's jump into one of their absolute favorite go-tos. The claim that the Old Testament predicted a virgin birth for Jesus. The verse they always pull out, Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. It says something like, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. See, they say, predicted Jesus' virgin birth right there. But here's where we need to rewind the tape way back to the actual historical context of this verse. First off, Isaiah wasn't just one lone prophet dude writing a single book. Scholars pretty much agree the book of Isaiah is a collection of writings from different authors, put together over a couple of centuries, roughly from the 7th to the 5th centuries BC. Now, this specific part of Isaiah chapter 7, was written during a political crisis around the 8th century BC. The king of Judah at the time was a guy named Ahaz, and King Ahaz was facing a major threat. The powerful Assyrian Empire was on the rise, and some smaller kingdoms allied against Judah. Ahaz was panicking. Isaiah chapter 7 is actually a message to King Ahaz. It's meant to reassure him. God, through the prophet, offers Ahaz a sign that Judah will be okay. And the sign? Isaiah 7:14. Let's look closely at that key word. The Hebrew word used there is alma. Now, alma means a young woman, typically one who is unmarried, and yes, could be a virgin, but the word itself doesn't require virginity. It's the common word for a young woman of marriageable age. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, done centuries later, used the word parthenos, which does specifically mean virgin, but the original Hebrew text, alma, young woman. And what is the sign? A young woman is pregnant or will become pregnant, and before that child is old enough to know certain things, the immediate threat to King Ahaz will be gone. Who was this child born during King Ahaz's time, whose birth was a sign of reassurance in that specific political moment? Most biblical scholars agree the child being referred to is King Hezekiah, Ahaz's son, who became king around 715 BC. When Christians claim this is a prophecy about Jesus' virgin birth, they're completely ripping it out of its original historical, textual, and political context. It was about a young woman, a king, a threat in the 8th century BC, and the birth of King Hezekiah. Period. Not Jesus. And this isn't the only time they do this. Let's look at another favorite, the Bethlehem birth. Alright, diving into our next piece of supposed prophecy, the claim that the Old Testament said the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. The go-to verse here is from the book of Micah, chapter 5, verse 2. This verse reads something like, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come from me one who will be ruler over Israel, one whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." And Christians say, boom, Bethlehem birth predicted. Just like Isaiah, the book of Micah isn't necessarily the work of just one individual. It likely comes from a school of prophets writing during times of major upheaval for the Jews, possibly even during the period leading up to or after the Babylonian exile, which was a pretty big deal, obviously. Now, look at that verse again. Bethlehem Ephrathah. This isn't just talking about the small town of Bethlehem. Ephrathah was the older name for the region, and it was closely associated with the lineage and clan of King David, whose family originated from that area. Micah 5:2 is most likely a reference to a ruler coming from the lineage that traditionally hailed from the Bethlehem Ephrathah area. Basically, someone from the line of David. And guess what? Jewish history after Micah's time had figures from the Davidic line who could easily fit the description of a ruler coming from that lineage. A key candidate is Zerubbabel, a descendant of David who became a leader, essentially a governor or king under the Persians after the exile around 525 BC. He fit the bill way better in the context of Jewish history and expectations than someone centuries later. So what did the author of the Gospel of Matthew do? He took this reference to a lineage or clan originating from the Bethlehem Ephrathah area and conveniently reinterpreted it to mean the literal town of Bethlehem, just to make it fit his narrative about Jesus' birth. They weren't poring over these texts for historical accuracy or the original meaning. They were mining Jewish scripture for anything that could be repurposed, twisted, and wrenched out of context to give their Jesus stories some kind of ancient, seemingly predicted pedigree. This isn't prophecy. It's taking an old text and forcing it to say something it never intended to say, centuries later. And this pattern of reinterpretation is the key to understanding all these prophecy claims. So what do the Isaiah and Micah examples show us? They show us that the people writing these ancient texts were focused squarely on their own time. They were talking about their kings, their political crises, They're religious messages for their contemporaries. These weren't fortune tellers with crystal balls, somehow charting out events that would happen 500, 800, 1,000 years in their future. That's just not what those texts are. So how did the gospel writers manage to make it look like these ancient writings were all about Jesus? Well, it wasn't rocket science, but it was effective. They achieved it by taking these older texts and quite simply reinterpreting them. They would grab snippets, often just a verse or two, completely wrench them out of their original historical and literary context, and then slot them into their new story about Jesus. They weren't revealing hidden prophecy. They were mining Jewish scripture like it was a quarry, looking for anything they could repurpose and force fit to lend legitimacy to the narrative they were creating. And frankly, this kind of textual massaging was a lot easier to pull off back then, when religious texts weren't widely available, and a small group of scribes and priests largely controlled what was written, copied, and interpreted. They weren't uncovering divine blueprints for the future. They were giving their new story a fake historical pedigree by twisting the meaning of older revered writings. It's not prophecy coming true. It's reinterpretation being presented as prophecy. And that distinction is key to understanding why this entire prophecy fulfillment argument is fundamentally flawed. So, there you have it. When Christian apologists trot out these Old Testament prophecies as proof for Jesus, whether it's the virgin birth from Isaiah or the Bethlehem birthplace from Micah, remember what's actually happening. They're taking ancient texts, written for specific people, in specific historical situations that had nothing to do with a guy centuries later, and they're twisting them, stripping away their original meaning, and shoehorning them into the Gospels. This isn't historical evidence. This isn't divine foresight. These aren't smoking guns of prophecy fulfilled. This is skillful, or perhaps not so skillful, reinterpretation and textual manipulation. So to answer the question, is it prophecy? Absolutely not. It is, as we called it from the start, just plain piffle. Thanks for watching this breakdown on the Rational Fareed. If you found this look behind the curtain helpful, please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let me know your thoughts on this topic down in the comments below. See you on the next one.